welcome to episode 14 of Toke TV, your roundup of the biggest stories in cannabis and hemp news of the week. I'm Steve Elliott, your host. I'm editor of TokeSignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. First, let's look at a couple of beautiful bud picks of the week. We have this week from photographer Bob Montoya. This strain has a very special story behind it. It's called Cashie's Honey, and these photos were taken 3 weeks into flower. This strain was developed in part by Mike Hyde for his son, cancer patient Cash Hyde, and it is named in his honor and his memory. This is Cashie's strain, and as you can see, it's a very beautiful one. Let's do the news. We have crossed a very important threshold in the marijuana movement. For the first time ever, a new Gallup poll shows that 58% of Americans support making marijuana legal. This Gallup poll, released on Tuesday, of voters nationwide shows that a big majority now think the use of marijuana should be made legal, with only 39% of respondents saying that it should remain illegal. Support has increased by 8 full percentage points since Gallup asked the same question in October 2011, at which time it found a record high 50% in favor. The poll is the first conducted by Gallup since voters in Colorado and Washington approved ballot measures making marijuana legal for adults 21 and older, and establishing state-regulated systems of marijuana cultivation and sales. It also comes nearly 2 months after the U.S. Department of Justice announced it would not interfere in the implementation of these new state laws and others that effectively regulate marijuana for medical use. This national poll of 1,028 registered voters was conducted October 3rd through 6th, and it has a margin of error of plus or minus 4%. According to Rob Campia, Executive Director of the Marijuana Policy Project, the dramatically increasing support for making marijuana legal should come as no surprise. Marijuana prohibition has been an abject failure, Campia said. Most Americans realize it is unjust, wasteful, and counterproductive to invest in the criminalization of adults for using a substance that is far less harmful than alcohol. The news of such widespread support for ending marijuana prohibition bodes well for efforts underway to change state laws around the nation, according to Campia. 2 states are in the process of regulating marijuana like alcohol, and in the next few years, we will surely see others do the same, he said. It's time for Congress to take this issue head on, according to Campia. It should no longer be considered scary or troublesome to speak out in support of more sensible marijuana policies. We need to put marijuana prohibition behind us, and our leaders need to step up to move things forward. These latest poll results point to the absurdity and even the venality of persisting with these harsh prohibitionist policies, according to Ethan Nadelman, founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. No other law is enforced so harshly and pervasively, yet deemed unnecessary by so many Americans. Spending billions of dollars and arresting 750,000 people annually for violating marijuana laws now represents not just foolish public policy, but also an inappropriate and indecent use of police powers to favor one side of a cultural and political debate, Nadelman said. The passage of adult use marijuana initiatives in Colorado and Washington has demonstrated widespread disillusion with marijuana prohibition, according to Aaron Smith, executive director of the National Cannabis Industry Association. The success of regulated medical and adult use marijuana markets in 17 states and D.C. is replacing criminal enterprises with legal and responsible businesses that generate millions in tax revenue and thousands, tens of thousands of good jobs, according to Smith. It's no surprise that 58% of Americans now support bringing this regulated approach to all 50 states, according to Smith. In Washington, we have, of course, the implementation of our legalization law here, I-502. And we have some disquieting news this week from the State Liquor Control Board, which has been put in charge of marijuana. This board, in its recommended policies, which were released this week, has proposed taking away patient home grows and shutting down medical marijuana dispensaries in the state of Washington. The state's plan is to force medical marijuana patients to use I-502's recreational marijuana stores rather than the medical marijuana dispensaries they currently use. The Liquor Control Board on Monday proposed new rules, and these rules would effectively outlaw medical marijuana dispensaries next year and home growing by patients as well when recreational marijuana stores start opening, as 502 approved by voters last November is implemented in Washington. This work group, which also included representatives of the Department of Health and the Department of Revenue, was formed after state lawmakers and law enforcement raised concerns that licensed marijuana stores wouldn't be able to compete with medical marijuana dispensaries. Patients are currently allowed in Washington 15 plants of any size and 24 ounces of dried marijuana under Washington's medical marijuana law, which has been in place for 15 years now. These new rules would force patients, many of whom are quite ill and on limited incomes, to stop growing at home or in collectives and to buy the heavily taxed marijuana, which will theoretically be available in state licensed stores next summer. There will be a safe and consistent supply of tested labeled marijuana available for people, according to Mikhail Carpenter, spokesman of the Liquor Control Board. But he didn't mention the fact that under 502's rules, state licensed recreational marijuana stores will not be allowed to mention the medicinal uses of cannabis at all. If enacted, these recommendations will help provide patients with an adequate, safe, and secure source of medical marijuana, Carpenter claimed in a press release. Among the recommendations are developing a registry for patients and their designated providers. No patient registry currently exists in Washington. Reducing the amount of marijuana qualified patients or designated providers may possess at one time. That reduction would be from the current 24 ounces to just 3 ounces. And requiring patients to receive an in-person exam by a qualified healthcare provider before medical marijuana can be authorized. And no problem on that last one. Every qualified medical marijuana patient in the state has already had that exam. What they are trying to do is cast aspersions on the reality of those exams, of course. Safe access to medical marijuana for patients will be drastically reduced if these proposed rules are implemented. Seattle now has about 200 medical marijuana dispensaries, but has been allotted just 21 recreational marijuana stores, according to the Seattle Times. Now, this move is in direct contradiction of promises repeatedly made by I-502 proponents, including chief author Allison Holcomb of the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington, that the recreational cannabis legalization initiative would not negatively impact the patient community. It wouldn't have been quite so bad if the intentions behind I-502 had been honestly presented from the beginning. But it appears more and more obvious that it was a greedy, arrogant scam from the get-go. The fact that it was solemnly presented as not affecting patients at all is particularly galling. I was stupid enough to believe Holcomb and her company, medical marijuana patient Ryan Blackhawk, told me on Monday. This is the first time I have ever been ashamed of the way I voted. We need real legalization that protects the rights of everyone, not just recreational users and not just medical users. I do research on every issue and candidate before I vote, Blackhawk told me. This vote was not done in a vacuum. I feel totally betrayed. She lied her lying face off to me. Lies, 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 commented Tacoma activist Doc OZ, then tagged as an unregulated bunch of fakers by those who lied. A whole hell of a bunch of us read and duly noted every last bit of fine print, only to be thoroughly shot upon by those working on that fabled legal ounce while slinging some of the most absurd accusations known to man. Because they knew we were lying, quote unquote, they attacked instead of replying to our concerns. Some of us took a lot of flack for not supporting it, but then again, there are and were some of us who could see what nonsense that measure actually brought to the table. Port Orchard activist Renee Eli told Toke Signals. We used to pay $180 for permission to grow, said Seattle activist Jared Alloway, referring to the cost of a medical marijuana authorization. Now we pay $1,000. Nice progress. Commercial grow licenses will cost $1,000 under I-502, but no home growing will be allowed. Now, what they're telling us is that you must buy your medical marijuana at a store where they're forbidden to mention medical marijuana. Washington collective operators can only look wistfully over at Colorado, where the first tier of recreational marijuana stores will, by statute, all be owned by existing dispensary operators. Contrast that to Washington, where recreational marijuana stores will be forbidden to even mention the fact that cannabis has medicinal uses. Yeah, this is where they plan to send seriously ill patients, many of them brand new to the world of medical cannabis, to get their medicine, to a place where the employees know nothing about medical marijuana, and even if they did, they're forbidden to talk about it. What about new patients who need guidance to find the proper strains? Great idea, guys. It would make a lot more sense to do as Colorado and let people who know about cannabis as medicine dispense it, not amateurs. After all, should party stores sell Vicodin? It can, after all, be used or abused recreationally. Let's make the analogy more accurate here. Once these party stores start selling recreational Vicodin, then maybe we should outlaw pharmacists from dispensing it and focus on it as a get high and party substance, entirely discounting its medicinal uses and actually forbidding store employees from discussing Vicodin as medicine. So it's as if you can buy Vicodin at Party City, folks, not at the pharmacy anymore. And Party City can only tell you about how fun it is to take Vicodin as a party drug, but are not allowed to tell you about its pain-easing properties. I think what we can learn from this is that we have to be really careful whom we trust. We've been treated, since it became clear that the state was moving to shut down medical marijuana dispensaries due to the passage of I-502, to the spectacle of clueless, braying jackasses like Washington Normal's Keith Henson and Radical Russ Belville, averring that dispensaries were never legal to begin with, despite the fact that both collective gardens and the exchange of cash for cannabis has been legal all along under I-502. Now, both Keith Henson and Russ Belville actually lifted that line about dispensaries never having been legal to begin with straight from Allison Holcomb. She started repeating the dispensaries were never legal meme a few months ago, once the writing was clearly on the wall, and has flogged it ad nauseum ever since. The unseemly spectacle of reporters like The Strangers, perhaps well-meaning but hapless Dominic Holden, enthusiastically endorsing I-502 last fall, cluelessly repeating the lies told him by the New Approach Washington crowd, was painful enough at the time. The dude even wrote a purpled passage soliloquy about how he had been waiting for this all his life. It has reached the level of acute embarrassment. One can only imagine, if it has truly dawned upon Dom, just how painful a primrose path he laid out for patients. Now, however, we are entering entirely new territory. Both patient home grows of up to 15 plants and patient possession limits of 24 ounces are specifically legal under state law. How will Holcomb, Henson, and Belville squirm out of just admitting that the medical marijuana law is being gutted in this state? Never mind, who cares? It comes down to Holcomb's callow calculus of ambition, in which her rising political star eclipsed the well-being of thousands of seriously ill patients nationwide. Now, it would be grimly funny that greed heads like Morocco of Seattle's Green Buddha dispensary will soon be out of business by their own doing. Morocco was one of the first dispensary owners to go over to the I-502 side. But for everyone else in the medical marijuana community, of course, it's not so goddamn chuckle-worthy. Now, it's deeply obscene to make it nigh impossible for seriously ill, financially poor patients to get relief from the only strains that work. And making this scenario even more tragic is that many of the strains which work the best for patients, including high CBD strains that provide enormous pain and inflammation relief, but don't get you high, will almost certainly not be available in recreational marijuana stores focused on the party market. Doubly unfortunate is the fact that concentrates such as Rick Simpson oil won't be sold in state-licensed recreational pot stores. There are patients whose lives depend upon a steady source of RSO. Good old compassionate green Washington will be taking a huge black eye on a very public stage. With home growing and collectives taken away from patients, suddenly state officials look like a bunch of greedy, inhuman shysters. I want to know which of these elected officials promised to lock up cancer patients and multiple sclerosis patients in their last campaign, and promised to take away their medicine and their right to a medical defense in court. Steve Serich told Toke Signals on Tuesday. You can bet that we'll be mentioning that when they're up for re-election. If you think these current recommendations are bad, please understand that they always leave the worst, most heinous changes for amendments on the floor of the House and Senate, Serich told us. That way there's no public comment, and don't think that anything remotely positive will end up in the bill. The fix is in, and the governor will sectional veto anything that the LCB doesn't want in this bill. If they're counting on creating a division in the community this year that they can exploit, they're more delusional than ever in Olympia, Serich said. How high a body count? is the state of Washington willing to accept? How many patients will die before Washington's enlightened image becomes threadbare? Allison Holcomb was unrepentant on Monday, claiming that taking away collectives and home grows from patients is actually a good thing. What Initiative 502 does for patients is offer them something that they haven't had before, which is quality control over the product that is being sold to them, Holcomb said. She neglected to mention that the ultimate in quality control is growing your own, which is being taken away. They're going to know who's growing it and where it came from, she said. The irony here is incredibly thick and obnoxious. And it will be available to them whenever they want it in a licensed store that's legal under the law, Holcomb said. They won't have to worry about crossing the threshold and getting arrested. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the cruel irony of Allison's statement. They won't have to worry about crossing the threshold and getting arrested. It's not immediately obvious how Holcomb believes that reducing the patient possession limit from 24 ounces to 3 ounces means patients won't have to worry about crossing the threshold. And if patients dare to try to go any for themselves, that threshold just changed from 15 plants to 0 if these recommendations are followed. How many seriously ill patients who can't afford the strains in state stores or who are unable to get the strains or concentrates they need there will be arrested for growing their own, as they've been allowed to do for 15 years now under RCW 69.51A, as amended by the Washington legislature. Despite those hollow assurances of not harming patients, now it seems that state officials believe that two marijuana distribution systems, recreational and medical, can't exist side by side, especially since the I-502 stores will be heavily regulated and taxed. It comes down to a matter of competition, and state officials seem determined to remove any competition from the equation. Lawmakers are concerned that the medical system, which they have already claimed is mostly fake anyway, will be a rival that undercuts the recreational marijuana distribution system's ability to collect those fat tax revenues that have state officials salivating. What they're doing is they're trying to eliminate medical, Steve Surich told me. According to Surich of the Cannabis Action Coalition, greed is the reason. What better way to get rid of the competition? You just make them illegal again, Surich said. We are not going to make 200,000 patients in the state of Washington criminals again. That is not what the voters voted for. One reason that state lawmakers have been so cavalier about destroying medicinal channels of access to cannabis has already become quite obvious. Many or most in the legislature, prominently including former narcotics cop Representative Christopher Hurst, have already decided, without any, scientific studies or actual numbers to back them up, that most patients are faking it. Hurst even mentioned a figure of 9 out of 10 medical marijuana patients being liars, a figure which he apparently pulled out of thin air. The Liquor Control Board glommed onto marijuana to replace their lost industry. They made such a mess of dispensing alcohol in Washington that voters effectively fired them from doing so anymore. Now they've been put in charge of cannabis. What could go wrong? Most of the politicians in Olympia are too ignorant on this topic to understand what's happening. Few, if any of them, understand how ridiculous this makes the state look, to be fostering recreational drug use while simultaneously outlawing a voter-approved system which has worked for 15 years to provide safe access to seriously ill patients. I can tell you that vindication is way overrated in this instance. I've never been so sad to be proven right. Moving on to the next story. Manufacturing of crisis. Stone driving epidemic? Please. It was bound to occur once marijuana legalization started actually happening. The prohibitionists and the drug warriors never go down without a fight. They always find an angle. This time, as 2 states, Colorado and Washington, have already legalized, in a limited way, recreational cannabis, the new bugaboo is driving while high. Nobody's sure how to solve the question of when someone is just too stoned to drive, but this doesn't keep plenty of people from offering solutions to the problem, which is now graduating from just a problem, thanks to sensationalist mainstream press coverage. Now it's becoming an epidemic or even a crisis. Welcome to legislation by press hysteria, same as you got in the UK a few years ago, when tabloid press coverage about killer skunk weed, which supposedly causes psychosis, resulted in Britain actually backtracking on its own progressive cannabis laws. This time, we're supposed to be scared shitless of stoned drivers running amok on our highways. Nobody wants to share the road with a bunch of impaired morons But is it really that simple? Think about it. How many of your friends have that time I was so drunk I smashed up my car stories? Several of them, if your friends are like mine. Now, how many of them have that time I was so high on pot I smashed up my car stories? None? Exactly. Of course, that hasn't stopped rabid anti-marijuana nut jobs like Dr. Bob DuPont, drug czar for Presidents Nixon and Ford, from making dire pronouncements which have little contact with consensual reality. Dr. DuPont, who is now president of the Institute for Behavior and Health, which, surprise, works to reduce drug abuse, claims research proves the terrible carnage out there on the roads caused by marijuana. That's a quote. But if marijuana really did pose a major hazard to highway safety, you can believe that we'd already have noticed the gory results. Same as we did back when alcohol prohibition ended and the automobile fatalities started adding up. Pretty quickly, it became impossible to ignore the death toll that alcohol was taking among motorists. And that's the point. Our roads haven't been painted red with the blood of marijuana impaired drivers and their victims, and there's a reason why. Cannabis, especially for experienced users, just doesn't impair driving ability to the degree that alcohol does, or for that matter, opiate pain medication or even nerve pills like Xanax or Valium. At least one scientific study shows that traffic fatalities are reduced in states which legalize medical marijuana, with a nearly 9% drop in traffic deaths and a 5% reduction in beer sales. Our research suggests that the legalization of medical marijuana reduces traffic fatalities through reducing alcohol consumption by young adults, said Daniel Rees, professor of economics at the University of Colorado, Denver, who co-authored that study. As public consciousness has risen around the hazards of drunk driving, people have reduced that kind of behavior. A recent nationwide census of fatal traffic accidents showed that deadly crashes have declined in recent years. So where is the supposed carnage caused by marijuana-impaired drivers? With estimates of current marijuana users in the United States running between 40 and 100 million, you can bet that if weed truly caused wrecks, it would be a national tragedy on the level of that already experienced with drunk driving. Sure, it's a bad idea for novice marijuana users to hit the highway just after ripping a few bong hits. But for the rest of us, especially medicinal cannabis patients who by necessity use and are accustomed to the effects of large amounts of herb every day, it's not a major factor. Emerging scientific research indicates that cannabis actually has far less impact on the psychomotor skills needed for driving than alcohol does, and is seldom a causal factor in automobile accidents, according to the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, which has studies to back that statement up. Too bad NORML decided to ignore the evidence in their own policy last year when they vocally supported Washington's I-502, which punishes not impairment, but a particular blood THC level. But of course, those who are comfortable with and accustomed to the current paradigm surrounding alcohol impairment, as in a certain blood level means that you are per se guilty of driving under the influence, DUI, they'd like to see that blood alcohol level for marijuana become codified into law as well. Besides the already mentioned phenomenon of experienced marijuana users not showing meaningful driving impairment, an additional complication is that since THC, the main active ingredient in marijuana, closely matches an endogenous body chemical, anandamide, that your body isn't in any hurry to get rid of, the way it is with poison such as alcohol, cocaine, or methamphetamine, all of which are processed and expelled by the body within 3 or 4 days. THC isn't like any of those substances. Your body, in fact, loves the stuff. It knows it's good. It holds on to it for as long as it can, a minimum of 30 days. If you think you're safe after 30 days, though, think again if you're a heavy user. I once tested positive for THC metabolites 63 days after my last ingestion while on probation. One Denver marijuana advocate said that government officials are scrambling for THC blood limits, at least in part because more drivers now admit using cannabis. The explosion of medical marijuana patients has led to a lot of drivers sticking that marijuana card in law enforcement's face and saying, "You can't do anything to me, I'm legal," said Sean McAllister. He's a lawyer who defends people charged with driving under the influence of cannabis. Driving while impaired by any drug is illegal in all 50 states already. Such determinations have so far traditionally been made at the discretion of the officer, who can write drivers up if they exhibit signs of impairment. But blood level limits take enforcement to a whole new level and make DUI marijuana charges practically impossible to beat in court, since a given level, for example, 5 nanograms per milliliter, as in Washington's legalization measure I-502, are per se evidence of guilt. Actual impairment no longer has to be proved by law enforcement. If that sounds as if Washington is allowing cops to declare open season on practically any driver of whom they disapprove, on the chance, or in some cases, as in medical marijuana patients, on the certainty that they will test positive for blood THC, then you're reading the law the same way I am. Using current scientific methods, there are no foolproof ways to correlate blood THC levels with impairment. Since unlike alcohol, THC stays in the blood for weeks after the 3 or 4 hour high wears off. Hence, any test which measures blood THC level is assuredly not measuring impairment at all. Unfortunately, the aforementioned anti-marijuana wingnut, drug czar DuPont, apparently has the ear of the Obama administration when it comes to drug driving legislation. DuPont wrote a paper last year on drug driving for the administration, which has now made the issue a priority. Physicians tell us that while many tests can show whether someone has recently used cannabis, it's much more difficult to pinpoint, quantify, or prove impairment at any certain time. Urine and blood tests can show that someone has used marijuana at some point in the past, which is why employers and probation officers like them. But neither of those tests can really determine current impairment. Scientists simply do not have conclusive data to link marijuana use to accident likelihood. The limited data available, some of which has actually shown experienced marijuana users drive more safely than unimpaired drivers, has prompted furious debate. All of this is why it seems nobody can agree on blood THC limits to determine impairment while driving. 2 states place the limit at 2 nanograms per milliliter. Some have zero tolerance policies, with just such a policy recently being proposed in California. In Washington, the threshold of 5 nanograms per milliliter is actually written into the language of legalization measure I-502. Such an attempt failed in the Colorado legislature in 2011. Denver Westward's pot critic William Breathes famously tested it more than 3 times over the limit after waking up in the morning unimpaired. State officials then set up a task force to settle the question, and the panel couldn't agree on a solution. I-502's backers claim their polling indicates the 5 nanogram per milliliter driving limit in the Washington State Initiative was critical to winning at the polls, but Colorado's Amendment 64 passed with no such limit included. Voters were very concerned about impaired driving, claimed Allison Holcomb, campaign director for New Approach Washington, the group behind the Evergreen State's legalization measure, which, by the way, didn't legalize home cultivation and only legalized up to an ounce. For its part, the White House, which has set a goal of reducing drug driving by 10% in the next 3 years, wants states to set a blood THC level upon which to base DUI convictions. But it hasn't said what that limit should be, which shouldn't be surprising since there's almost no science to support any particular level. Even with the White House supporting per se THC blood limits, drug czar Gil Kurlikowski admits there is no solid science behind such measures. I'll be dead, and so will lots of other people from old age, before we know the impairment levels for marijuana, Kurlikowski said. Gil seemed to even be arguing for zero tolerance when he called it a bogus argument to say any level of THC in a driver is safe. Meanwhile, patients in the 20 states and the District of Columbia, where medical marijuana is legal, may soon be at risk of getting criminal records just for trying to drive to work or the post office, since many of them are over 5 nanograms per milliliter when they wake up in the morning. They could be at risk for positive tests and a DUI conviction, whether they are impaired or not. In D.C., the medical marijuana dispensaries there, which have really just opened under their newly implemented law, say they are losing money. 3 months after the District of Columbia's medical marijuana program became operational, dispensaries in the nation's capital say that they are losing cash. All medical marijuana businesses are operating at a loss, according to David Gard, general manager at a DC dispensary called Capital City Care. The district's medical marijuana regulations are among the strictest in the nation, and that is part of the problem. The DC program is under close scrutiny because of its proximity to federal lawmakers and agencies. We're not that far from the Attorney General's office and other offices, and we want to make sure we're running an airtight program, said Dr. Faseha Waldo, a senior deputy director at the DC Department of Health. The continuity of the program is much more important to us. We want to make sure the program is sustainable and has a future. Of course, for that to happen, the dispensaries can't continue operating at a loss. We were prepared to see 200 to 300 patients showing up in our offices, Dr. Waldo said. That did not happen. So far, all we've been doing is bleeding cash, said Bob Simmons of Alternative Solutions, one of DC's 6 approved medical marijuana cultivation centers. Only 59 patients had been added to the registry of legal buyers, in D.C. in the first 3 months that the program has been operational. And since the program launched in D.C., only 62 physicians of the approximately 1,400 accredited by the district have picked up the medical marijuana recommendation forms. And of those 62, only 39 have actually filled them out. This low participation is said to be at least partly due to the doctors' fear of breaking federal law. Perhaps many of them are unaware of the Conant versus Walters decision, which said that doctors cannot be prosecuted for recommending medical marijuana. Down in Florida this week, Attorney General Pam Bondi asked the state Supreme Court to throw out the medical marijuana initiative that has been fielded there. Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi is challenging that proposal to put a ballot measure which will legalize medical marijuana before state voters on the November 2014 ballot. Bondi said on Thursday that she had sent a petition to the Florida Supreme Court along with the campaign's ballot language and petitions. The Attorney General claims that People United for Medical Marijuana, PUFM, led by Orlando Attorney John Morgan, filed misleading ballot language in describing how widely medical marijuana would be allowed under the measure. Bondi also complained that the ballot language failed to note that even if Florida voters approve the measure, marijuana will still be illegal under federal law. Its true scope and effect remain hidden, Bondi claimed in her petition to the Supreme Court. She charged that the wording was too broad and would allow doctors to authorize medical marijuana for almost any condition, and additionally argued that medical marijuana could not be called legal as long as it's illegal under Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act in federal law. Bondi's arguments would come as quite a surprise to the patients of California who have had safe access to medical marijuana for 17 years under state law, and to patients in 19 other states, which also passed medical marijuana laws without asking for federal permission. The South American country of Uruguay says that their government will sell legal marijuana for just $1 per gram. According to the country's drug czar, Julio Calzada, he's given higher estimates than that in the past. Now, this law has already been approved by Uruguay's lower house of Congress, and it's expected to pass in the Senate. It would make this South American nation the very first in the world to tax and regulate the legal production, distribution, and sale of cannabis. Calzada said that marijuana sales should start in the second half of 2014 at the price of about $1 per gram. Making money isn't the idea, according to Calzada, but rather the government wants to take the market away from illegal dealers. He had estimated back in August that government sold cannabis would cost about $2.50 a gram. Unfortunately, Uruguay says that it won't allow cannabis tourism. Sales are restricted to locals only. In Delaware this week, medical marijuana advocates recommended revising compassion center regulations. They say the proposed rules in Delaware would create supply problems for patients. The Marijuana Policy Project on Tuesday submitted comments recommending revisions to the Delaware Department of Health and Social Services proposed medical marijuana compassion center regulations. MPP is particularly concerned that the proposed rules would result in an inadequate supply of medical marijuana by allowing only a single compassion center instead of the 3 provided for in the law, and allowing that one dispensary to grow only 150 plants. Failing to allow for an appropriate and consistent supply will cause qualifying patients to either have to continue frequenting the criminal market or suffering without a medicine that can improve their quality of life, according to MPP. And that would also seriously compromise the financial sustainability of the successful applicants to run a dispensary, according to MPP. Since Governor Markell's announcement, the U.S. Department of Justice has released a new memo that provides that federal prosecutors should not target dispensaries based on their size alone. Robert Capici, Director of State Policies for the Marijuana Policy Project, commended Governor Markell and the Division of Public Health for moving forward with the program. And he said, while many of the proposed rules are reasonable, there are several that history has shown will result in compassion centers being unable to provide enough medicine for the patients. Seriously ill Delaware residents deserve legal protection for using the medicine that works best for them, but they also need safe and reliable access, according to Capici. Before we wind it up this week, let's look at one must-see story. There's an infographic on tokesignals.com that you want to take a look at. It's very interesting and quite educational. It reminded me of a couple of things that I hadn't thought about in a long time and taught me a couple of others. The infographic is called Up in Smoke, a timeline of marijuana in the United States. And it is well worth your time if you want to take a look at that. It's well done. I hope you have a great week. And until I see you next time, stay lifted.